Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, people of all races, colors, and creeds, welcome back to the greatest show on earth, the Investigative Journal. I'm your host, Greg Anthony, here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. And we have been doing a couple shows on where does all this evil come from? There's a whole lot of evil in the world. And we're going to get back to that tomorrow. But today, I wanted to talk about a pamphlet that was sent to me way back in the year, I think it was 2000, and it was written by Ronald Cooke, and he wrote this in 1985. I pulled it out of my archives because I thought it was interesting, and I hadn't seen it in a while, and wanted to refresh my memory as well as yours. And it's regarding the importance of understanding why we need to discuss the Jesuit order and the Vatican when we talk about the New World Order and what's going on in America and in the world. So I pulled an introduction that was written about this pamphlet, written in 1985 by John Daniels of Grand Design Exposed, and thought I would go through that. And John said this, he said, when reading this little book, remember Cooke wrote it in 1985. The world did not have a Jesuit pope back then, did they? And the founding of the Jesuits in 1534 was, of course, to counter the Reformation. Now, on September 24th, 2015, what happened? Again, we had the first Jesuit pope coming to America to speak to a joint session of Congress. Now, what does this tell us in 2015? It reveals that the Christians are under a strong delusion with the teaching of futurism and are unaware that the biblical, historical, and prophetical Antichrist is coming to address the lawmakers to celebrate the completion of the Jesuit counter-reformation in America. Now, John mentioned this, he said in 2 Theologians 2, 10 and 11, and with all the deceiving of the unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them a strong delusion, that they should believe a lie. Now, understanding in this introduction is not to take away from the author and the points made in the book, but remember, the author, when he wrote this, that's Cooke, didn't know that in 2013 we would have a Jesuit pope. And when writing the Vatican Jesuit Global Conspiracy, this is Cooke, he had no idea that in 2015 the Jesuits would have complete charge of the Vatican, and a Jesuit pope would speak to a joint session of Congress in 2015, just a few years ago. And I remember talking about that a lot on this show. So when you read this pamphlet, or when I give you a synopsis of it today, realize that the conspiracy that people call us conspiracy theorists, realize that it is alive, it is well and proceeding on schedule. And when I say conspiracy, I mean their conspiracy to overthrow this country. Now, he mentions that Pedro Arrupe, the Black Pope from 1963 to 1983, is mentioned on page 10, chapter 1 of the Jesuits in History in Cooke's pamphlet. And I'm looking at it right now. Cooke mentions author Gary Allen's book, No One Dare Call It a Conspiracy, using the Black Pope, Pedro Arrupe, to identify conspiracies and give us the agenda of the conspirators. Here is a quote from the Black Pope, Pedro Arrupe. This godless society operates in an extremely efficient manner, at least, in its higher levels of leadership. It makes use of every possible means at its disposal, be they scientific, technical, social, or economic. It follows a perfectly mapped out strategy It holds almost complete sway in the international organizations, in financial circles, in the field of mass communications, press, cinema, radio, and television. Now, Rupe, folks, gives a perfect description of what we talk about in the show. And let me go over a couple things. He said that they're involved in everything scientific, technical, social, and economic. Okay. They control international organizations, in financial circles, in the field of mass communications, press, cinema, radio, and television. And isn't that the connections that we make on this show? Giving you examples in each one of those categories. But then why? Why don't people catch on? And don't they think that America is in the process of change when they hear that just the Democratic Party is turning into a socialist party? And that 50% of millennials agree with that? Now, Arupi, like I said, gives a perfect description of how this biggest conspiracy on the earth really works. He is actually describing, and this is what John says, John Daniels in Grand Design Exposed, he's actually describing how Satan operates the Vatican, the Jesuit global conspiracy. Now, this is a very important point, he says. Remember, Gary Allen's book is about how global conspiracies operate in the world. And remember yesterday we talked about Jesuit casuistry and sophistry? It's exactly how it works. Now, Gary Allen's book takes the eyes off the Jesuits, though, and allows them to operate the global conspiracy unseen, because the puppet masters, the Jesuits, are right behind the curtain pulling the strings. It's like the pot calling the kettle black. The book, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, is taking the focus off the real conspiracy by using the Black Pope, Arupe, to give us the definition of the conspiracy. And John said this takes his breath away. Why? I read Gary Allen's book in 1993, he said, and at the time I knew nothing about them, the Jesuits. Let's look at how they operate using, what did we talk about? Casuistry and sophistry that we talked about yesterday. And remember how we mentioned it yesterday? We said casuistry was the dishonest reasoning on questions of morality by application of general principles, like same-sex marriage, abortion, or future Antichrist. Casuistry is a system of rationalization to do legally what is forbidden morally. And then we went into sophistry, and this is the art of influencing the thought and conduct of an audience by argumentation that is seemingly plausible but is actually invalid, misleading, and misrepresents the facts. Like 9/11, the government's version of what happened. Or like the assassination of JFK, the assassination of Lincoln, and the lone gunman story that everyone believes. It sounds plausible, but it's really fantasy taught as reality. And people, unfortunately, believe it. And you're getting both media, the media on the left and right, they argue completely, don't they? But they agree on 9/11, right? And they also hide the Jesuits, both of them. Now let's look at how the two work together. And I mentioned that yesterday. When I read Rulers of Evil, Chapter 9, page 74 by Tupper Saucy. And I won't go over that again, but he says basically logic, perspective, national memory, and self-discipline are purged to the point that unbridled emotion responses are all that's left. As economist Thomas Sowell put it, are all we have left. Now, if we move a little forward here, I wanted to get to what people were saying about the Jesuits back, way back when, right? Now, prior to the American Revolution, Catholics in the 13th colonies were forbidden to vote or to hold political office because of the centuries-old conflict between Rome and Protestant England. But once the revolution was over and the universal toleration was declared, the agents of Romanism immediately went to work to claim this country on behalf of the Pope. Fulton agreed. This is Justin D. Fulton, And he wrote a book about this in 1888, okay? And he agreed that the ancient conflict that had been responsible for the bloody horrors of the Dark Age had indeed come to the shores of the New World. Incredibly, he actually believed that Rome might be able to resurrect the Inquisition on American soil if the people were not awakened to the imminent danger. And you have to ask yourself, is there any truth to this warning? That was made back at almost in 1888. Now, with that in your mind, we have an understanding what it means to have a Jesuit Pope coming to speak to a joint session of Congress in 2015. We now can really see this warning that Fulton made, Justin D. Fulton, in that book, has come to pass. Now look at the cover of this book. And he puts on there, the serpent has entwined its folds around the Capitol. I'm looking at that right now. Now, what did men, we've gone over this a few times, but it's always good to refresh our memories. What did men in the 1800s think about the Vatican and the Jesuits? What did men have to say about Rome in the 1800s? Well, here's what Brigadier General Thomas M. Harris, in 1897, author of, quote, Rome's Responsibility for the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Boy, that's got lost in history, hasn't it? And he said this: Rome is simply a political machine for the enslavement of mankind. It is a monstrous despotism, relying on ignorance and its natural offspring, superstition, for its support. It is not a religion that we are called upon to fight, but a corrupt and most dangerous political organization whose purpose is nothing short of the destruction of our government. Whatever it may be as a religion, does not concern our present contention. Now, I've quoted Samuel Morse, the inventor of the Morse code, a number of times. In fact, I even talked to one of his relatives who had a small Christian ministry. This was maybe 10 years ago. And she was mentioning how they were even being persecuted to this day for being related to Mr. Morris. And he said this: the food of the popery is ignorance. Ignorance is the method of papal devotion. Ignorance is the legitimate prey of popery. Ignorance, the condition of being uneducated, unaware, or uninformed. One reason why I do this show. And Samuel Morse actually went to Rome during this period of time and came back and wrote a book about the foreign conspiracy against the liberties of this country, because he wanted to warn his fellow Americans. Well, where has these warnings gone? No one really believes this is important anymore. Now, in Cooke's book, The Vatican Jesuit Global Conspiracy, in light of 2015, Cooke, to be very, we'll find that Cooke was very profound and will be able to connect the dots with the real conspiracy, the man of sin, the son of perdition, the little horn in Daniel, the mother of harlots in the Revelation 17.5, with the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist. Now let's be clear in our minds of any preconceived idea, and let true biblical history reveal the Vatican Jesuit global conspiracy. So, when you look here, you'll see that in his book there's a preface. And I wanted to read his preface because it's really pretty important. Because he says, what I tried to do is sketch the role that the Vatican plays in world politics today and the goal and plan it has for the world. Now remember, this was not written long ago. We also look at the enormous financial resources that the Vatican possesses, and billions more which are at its disposal. We also look at the part that the Jesuits play in helping to implement the goal of the Vatican. In our travels, Cooke says, and teachings, we find that there is almost a total blackout concerning the sinister aspirations of the Vatican and the Jesuits. Men who purport to write on the great conspiracy that is out of control of the world not only never mention the Vatican, but if they do, they make the Vatican out to be the target of the conspiracy rather than the originator of it. It's obvious to anyone who's even remotely interested in the Vatican conspiracy The times have certainly changed the attitudes of Protestant Christians towards the Jesuits, haven't they? The word Jesuit, it used to conjure up in the minds of those who heard it a malevolent and satanic order. But times have really changed. Today, Jesuits are accorded reverence and respect in all segments of Western society. And yes, even allowed back into Eastern society after banned from countries like China for almost 30 years. And, he says, as you read this little pamphlet he put together, keep in mind a Jesuit Pope is coming to America. And this is what John Daniels is saying. He's coming to America to speak to a joint session of Congress, and he came in 2015. Now, remember, former President Nixon, we're going to talk about Nixon, and if you start looking at all the presidents after him, they always have Jesuit people involved with them. Nixon used to use the Jesuit to write his speeches. Jesuit are leading lights in the modern dialogue of the ecumenical movement, so that at least in the United States, an aura of respectability now surrounds the workings of them. Not all Americans or even all American Roman Catholics are impressed with them, but the plans of the Vatican hierarchy are proceeding along clearly defined lines, no matter whether some Roman Catholics may approve or not. The Vatican and the Jesuits have the same goal in mind. They are both working to bring the world to the feet of the Roman pontiff. The Jesuits have been backing the Marxists in some trouble spots all over the world, back then especially in Latin America. The Pope wants to retain the close backing he enjoys from men like Ronald Reagan. Therefore, he pretended to reprimand the Jesuits for working with the Marxists in Central America. As we will see, says Cooke, the Marxists in Central America, as in Northern Ireland, all have good Roman Catholic credentials. What most people don't realize is that the Jesuits are the real CIA of the Vatican. That is, just as Washington often seems to be in conflict with and disavows some of the covert activities of the CIA, especially when they are going to prove embarrassing, so the Vatican from time to time will appear to disavow the activity of the Jesuits. And so, with that little preface in mind, I just did want to mention that he goes into a history of the Jesuits, which we have done many times on this show. So I wanted to skip and get right to the Jesuits of today as he saw it in 1985. Okay, so as he mentions here, he says that Americans have paid a half-hearted attention to Jesuit history, and I can attest to that because I've done it here many times on this show, and it seems to go in one ear and out the other. But a lot of people seem to believe that the intrigue of the Jesuits is needed today to counteract the communist menace. And he's talking about in 1985. But actually, look what back then, we've all heard of G. Gordon Liddy of Watergate fame. He was taught by the Jesuits, and nowhere does he apologize for their teachings or for his philosophy of life, which is based on the Jesuit teaching that the ends justify the means. So, folks, what you see them working both on the left and the right, don't you? In fact, he unashamedly, this is Liddy, advocates this teaching as the only way that America can survive. And the people of today are the same, no different. Fordham, he says, this is Liddy talking, Fordham was a feast for the mind and a challenge to the spirit. To begin with, it was still under the absolute control of the Jesuits. As much as I had admired the German Benedictines, I admired the Jesuits more. The Society of Jesus was something special, the shock troop of the Catholic Church. And he went on to say that Heinrich Himmler used it as a model for his dreaded black uniform SS in Hitler's Germany, and that the SS swore a special oath of loyalty to the Führer, just as the highest order of the Jesuits swore a special oath of loyalty to the Pope. Liddy says later on that, just as I do, John Sirica believes the end justifies the means. The Jesuits obviously have gained respectability in our time. They have come a long way since John Adams, the second president of the United States, wrote in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, "If ever there be a body of men who merited eternal damnation on earth and in hell, it is the Society of Loyola." Now, John G. Schmitz, who ran for president on the American Party ticket a few years ago, was educated by the Jesuits. His education by the Jesuits was put forward as something in his favor rather than a liability. He also wrote the foreword to Gary Allen's book, No One Dare Call It a Conspiracy. So we live in remarkable times when Jesuit-trained leaders can write about conspiracy and be accepted not only by the general public, but by professed conservative Protestant Christianity. Jerry Brown, back then the governor of California, who has twice sought the presidential nomination, was also educated by the Jesuits. Again, this was not something considered a liability. Rather, it was advertised as proof of his moral fiber and strength of character. Times certainly have changed in America from the days of Lincoln, from the days when Samuel Morris went to Rome and came back warning what would happen to this country. Times have certainly changed. And you can thank your politicians, you can thank your media on both the left and the right for never giving you the facts, not only the historical facts, but the present-day facts of really what's going on behind the scenes. That's why I always say we're living in a fantasy world. This is not reality. It's one they've created for us, and it's best you get out of it. There's not that much time. So anyway, Harry Reason, remember him? He was a journalist back when. As he was signing off his nationally televised newscast a few years ago, this was in '85, also demonstrated how far the Jesuits have come in gaining complete acceptance in the United States. He told a joke, and I'm going to get to that joke in the second half hour of the investigative journal. I've got 2 minutes here, and I did want to mention that we're going to get back tomorrow to the series I'm running on. There's a whole lot of evil in the world. We're going through some of the evil organizations as well as some of the evil rituals, as well as evil locations in the world, and they all seem to have a Jesuit behind every rock. I had to say that because I remember back in the old days when I would do these shows, my critics would always say, "Greg, you're crazy. You see a Jesuit behind every rock. They're only educated priests trying to help us. They have no money." They used to, of course, but those days are over. And boy, I'll tell you what, those people let me realize back then that I was on the right track. And I should tell you also, they did try to marginalize me back then. And they would put articles on the website that I was a MK Ultra. I was involved with the military handler. They even gave a name. I never could figure out who the hell he was. And I realized, hey, you're on the right track, Greg, when they start doing this kind of thing. And so it goes on, folks. They're going to try to cover the story up. They're going to try to argue it away. And they're going to keep it away from you. And at best, you start looking into some things on your own. And in a sense, if you start doing that, you'll realize that we're living in nothing but this created fantasy world. Whether it be the wars they create, whether it be the politics they create, the movements they create, all with one thing in mind, to get to a one world order, a one world religion. And it isn't going to be a good thing. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn, the Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This ain't happening.
Okay, back for the second half hour of the investigative journal, and I was just going over a pamphlet that was sent to me years ago, and it was written by Ronald Cooke back in 1985 regarding the warning that many American patriots gave to America back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, about Vatican Jesuit intentions for America, which have not gone heeded, by the way. And we're going over remember Harry Reasoner? I believe he worked with ABC, but I'm not sure. He was a television talking head. But as he was signing off his nationally televised newscast a few years ago, this was said in 1985, he also demonstrated how far the Jesuits have come in gaining complete acceptance in the United States. Now, he told a joke about 3 orders in the Roman Catholic Church, and it went something like this. He said the Dominicans and the Franciscan and the Jesuits were all arguing about which order God loved the most. They went down to the altar and were told that they would receive the answer the next day. When they went back to the next day, there was a note on the altar which said, "I love you all equally, signed God S.J." Harry signed off, chuckling to himself. Of course, S.J. stands for the Society of Jesus. But while, Mr. Cooke could appreciate a joke, he didn't consider the Jesuits a laughing matter at all. For if the Bible is true, and you have to make that assumption, and we believe it is, he says, then the Jesuit idea of salvation by works, masses, and ceremonies has led millions, and is still leading millions to a lost eternity. To those who cherish biblical truth and the freedom to preach the true gospel, the rise of the Jesuits to a place of complete acceptance and indeed power in the United States today does not bode well for the future of this great land. And I can attest to this. Look, I've done my show and I've given, speeches to people that are true Christians, and I've given speeches to atheists. And what I find is that those who believe in the Bible really have a real incentive to read and to warn people regarding the Jesuit conspiracy to overthrow this country. I find others who do not take the Bible seriously to look at it only in kind of a political term, with a political meaning, and somehow seem to not have that ability to stand strong against these people. And I find that many of the Christians who have come against the Jesuits have been persecuted for it. And that's just what I've found over the years. But I think they understand that everything that Protestant Americans hold dear will be forfeited if these men ever gain the ascendancy and take over this land thoroughly. And the greatest proof of all that the Jesuits have indeed gained complete respectability in the United States is the startling fact that a man claiming to outline the global shadowy conspiracy that threatens the world should call in the leader of the Jesuits to substantiate and corroborate his thesis. No one informed in the area of church history would ever do such a thing unless he believed that the time had come when the Jesuits were no longer suspect themselves. And he was talking about Gary Allen. He believes that this time had arrived, and millions of conservative-oriented Americans who agree with Allen are either totally ignorant of the historical record or believe that the Jesuits have changed. Both, I might add, folks, is not true. They have not changed, and most people are ignorant of the historical record. It can be said without fear of contradiction that whether or not one agrees with the idea of Jesuit conspiracy, no Protestant who has studied church history would ever call in the leader of the Jesuits to corroborate his conspiracy. The Jesuits have not only gained complete respectability in the United States today, but they have also gained a great power. They own a controlling interest in the Bank of America, as well as many other financial interests that we on this show have talked about. But it doesn't seem to matter to people, does it? They just go in, it goes in one ear, out the other. And, they are thus able to influence Roman Catholic politicians to serve the ends of the Roman Catholic Church more vigorously. Now, the Vatican's vast financial empire is unbelievable, folks, and we've talked about it many times. We've also looked at trying to get to the bottom of the Vatican Bank. And when you do that, even through the lawsuits that were filed, one being Alpern v. Vatican Bank in the federal court in San Francisco, you'll see that the court blocks any kind of attempt to really get at the bottom of what these people are financially all about. So this goes deep. Now, the Jesuits have always been involved in intrigue at the highest levels of the United States government. During the administration of John F. Kennedy, the Jesuits had access to the most powerful office in the world. The Reverend James Vizard, an American Jesuit who served as a labor lobbyist in Washington, disclosed that in 1963 he was having lunch with another Jesuit, Roger Vekemans, a Belgian priest on assignment to Chile, when a White House car picked Vekemans up and took him to a meeting with President Kennedy, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and CIA Director John McCone, certainly the three most powerful men in the world at the time. And Vizard said this: Roger came back with a big smile on his face and said, "I got 10 million, 5 million overt from the AID, Agency of International Development, and 5 million from the covert CIA. Since that time, some other investigations have shown that there was a Roman Catholic bishop on the payroll in the CIA in Vietnam as late as 1971, that millions of dollars were sent by the U.S. government to help the Jesuits in Chile, a country then beset by assassinations and intrigue, and still embroiled in the murder and mayhem. And Cooke says when he was writing this, it was still controlled by a Roman Catholic military dictatorship. This is only the tip of the iceberg. It is obvious that the subject of Jesuit intrigue in the CIA has so far never been explored in depth whatsoever. And he brings up an interesting guy, Licio Gelli, whom some writers believe is the man who helps hold together the Vatican conspiracy, which is out of control in the world, has strong links with the CIA. He is the puppet master, David Yallop said in his book, God's Bankers. And Gelli was the puppet master with a few thousand strings, says Yallop. The strings appear to have led everywhere, to the heart of the Vatican, to the White House, to presidential palaces in a wide range of countries. Now, you got to understand this. Licio Gelli was a man that I remember, the head of the P2 Lodge in Rome when I was there. And since then, I've done many stories with other people from Italy about this man. He was actually at Reagan's inauguration, right behind him. And Gelli was the man who brought the Exocet missiles from France for Argentina in its war with Britain. And David Yallop says that the Vatican indirectly funded Gelli through Roberto Calvi and the Bank of Ambrosiano. He was an honored guest, this guy, at the presidential inauguration of Reagan. Gelli, of course, has strong ties with Michel Sindona. Remember all these names? He is the head of the P2 Lodge, the mysterious organization founded in Italy, which functions in Argentina, Venezuela, Paraguay, France, Portugal, Nicaragua, Switzerland, and the United States. It interlocks with the mafia in Italy, Cuba, and the United States, and also has military regimes in South America, and also with the CIA, and reaches right into the heart of the Vatican. And then those say, oh, Vatican has nothing to do with anything now. So the tentacles of this Vatican power structure are spread worldwide. Men come and go, but the organizations of the papacy perpetuate themselves and have done so for more than 1,000 years, making the Vatican the source of the most formidable intrigue in world history. But yet, our great historians in America, our great journalists getting paid millions of dollars in America on both Fox, CNN, ABC, NBC, all of these stations, MSNBC, all they seem to not think it's important to discuss what they're doing, who they are. Why? Because they're bought and paid for. They use the Hegelian dialectic. They work both the left and the right. The Jesuits control CNN. They control Fox. It's no secret. It's just something that needs to be discussed more, put out in the open. And you'll see that it works in a really kind of the way that David Yallop here was saying. So this tentacle of the Vatican power structure has spread worldwide. People come and go, like I said, but these organizations that have been here for 1,000 years are the ones that the politicians run to. And Pope John Paul, he said this. Remember him? The cyanide salesman from Poland? The fact that men and women living within the heart of the Roman Catholic Church cannot speak openly and be identified is an eloquent comment on the state of affairs within the Vatican. The Pope has called for the Jesuits to cease from their intrigue in Central America. On March 2, 1982, over 100 Jesuit provincial superiors, the leaders of the order, were called to Rome for discussions with Father Paolo Dezza, the man who the Pope had appointed to oversee the order in 1981. Now, it's very interesting because you see this throughout the course of history, the Jesuits and the Pope coming at loggerheads. But I believe that it's only for public consumption, that they really need each other to work together, hand in glove. So, you know something? The Jesuits are still in the thick of murders and assassinations, which are being carried out on both sides of the war. For example, looking back to El Salvador, the Pope, and we can look to Syria today, the Pope, like others before him, brings it to the forefront, but really, both of them work together. So, we're looking at, this time at Latin America, back then in the 80s, which was entrenched 300 or 400 years, has not brought any freedom or justice to the oppressed millions who live below the border of the United States. It's still going on. And well below the abject poverty line Romanism has managed to keep the multiplied millions in such a state of miserable existence that we have no hesitation in saying that if Americans rebelled against George III for his repression, they would have rebelled long ago against almost every government in Latin America. Instead, the United States bolsters the repression of Rome all over Latin America, paving the way for the inevitable revolution and liberation promised by the Marxists back then. It is time for the United States stop. It is time the United States stop identifying with Romanism. But we know that will never happen. But while the coverage of the news, public opinion in the United States will enable Rome to keep its stranglehold on the people, either by repressive fascist governments as in Chile back then, or repressive Marxist government dictatorships in Nicaragua back then. Not only that, but the Vatican wants the U.S. to fund the rebuilding of these regions while the Church retains control over the people. So, there we go. What I did want to do is to continue and get to a couple more. Okay, so we can see that the Vatican is the center that's never discussed of a never-ending web of conspiracy. It is working day and night to bring the world to the feet of the Roman pontiff. The Vatican's octopus has tentacles reaching into almost every government circle on earth. That's why I mentioned go to concordat.com, concordatwatch.com or concordat.com, and you can see over the 200 different agreements that the Vatican has, written agreements, treaties with other countries. Amazing. Now, when the Red Chinese needed the offshore drilling expertise of the United States, no other country possesses it, a bargain was struck so that the Jesuits were once again allowed into China. Surely such a move is almost incredible when viewed in the light of the fact that America is still an overwhelmingly Protestant nation, at least in the numerical makeup of her population. Vatican works incessantly at building bridges over which its plans may be put into operation. Remember, Pedro Rupi, then head of the Jesuits, was the man that Pope Paul VI sent to Moscow in 1971. He met with the communists to try to get them to get the then repressive government of Czechoslovakia to relax their repressive policies. When he returned from Moscow, he stated that he saw signs of relaxation of religious persecution in Russia. Billy Graham came back with the same line. Rupi was immediately challenged by the director of the Lithuanian Catholic Aid, who said that a Rupi statement was a time-serving Soviet maneuver used in order to create a false impression. It is obvious the Vatican wants a soft line taken then towards communist Russia because the ultimate goal of the one world church envisioned by the Vatican is the total absorption of all into the one true fold of Romanism, no matter if you're from Rome, Russia, or America. You know, Bible Protestantism is the only faith that can never capitulate to Romanism. Romanism, with its ability to absorb false religions into its fold, will become the cage of every unclean bird. But it can never absorb Protestantism because the difference between the two is of such a nature that union is spiritually and ecclesiastically impossible. This is the reason biblically ignorant newsmen speak of the bigotry of the Bible-believing fundamentalists of our time. They do not realize the eternal difference that exists between a vital biblical Christianity on the one hand and all the false religions on the other. So Bible Protestantism must ultimately be the target of every conspiracy and the target of the final apostate conglomerate. That's why you see Christian persecution going on all over the world. So not only were many of the founders of the United States government Masons, right? Yes, and I have to look at something real quickly. Okay, so I was saying not only were many of the founders of the United States Masons, but they received aid from this secret and august body existing in Europe, which helped them to establish this country. and for a particular purpose known only to the initiated few. The Great Seal, look at the reverse of the dollar bill, is the signature of this exalted body, unseen and for the most part unknown. An unfinished pyramid upon its reverse side is a trestle board setting forth symbolically the task to the accomplishment of which the United States government was dedicated from the day of its inception. And this basically was taken from the writings of Manly P. Hall, Secret Teachings of All Ages, a well-known Masonic writer. Now, we have to understand that the financial empire of the Vatican is second to none. Whenever anyone writes on the conspiracy money, he is always given a prominent place. In this regard, the Vatican certainly does not take a back seat to anybody. The wealth of the Vatican, as we will see, is so vast that in all probability its true worth will never ever be known. We're going to examine in some detail, says Cooke, what various writers who have tried to research the wealth of the Vatican have said. Several of these writers are members of the Roman Catholic Church. It is surely interesting to every Protestant that when Pope Paul brought his entourage from Milan to the Vatican, they were dubbed the Roman Catholic writers as the Milan Mafia. It is not within the bounds of this study, says Cooke, to examine the Mafia in detail, but the Cosa Nostra, the family of the Mafia, are a 100% Roman Catholic outfit. They originated in Sicily, where Michel Sindona was also born, and remember him, involved in the Vatican Bank scandal in the 80s. They control vast holdings in Italy and North America. They have gone what they call legit in the many enterprises and were able to close down an entire cheese plant in Wisconsin. They did this to establish a monopoly in the pizza business. This incident made the national news. Businessmen came in and bought the cheese factory. After they bought it, they closed it down. It was only later that the mafia involvement was discovered. As far as we know, the factory, back then, which employed most of the town's workforce, was still closed at the time. Cooke's interesting to notice the timing of the move by the mafia to control this, he said. And Panatella, a Vatican-controlled company dealing mainly in flour and pasta, lost $2.5 million just prior to the mafia takeover and requiring financing of $4.8 million to keep it afloat. You know, he was also disclosed that the late 60s, both the Institute for Religious Works, whose assets were conservatively put at $3 billion, and the Special Administration of Holy See property were invested in every sector of the Italian industry and commerce. Now, he went on to say, when they were talking about this, on the board of directors of companies in which the Vatican had an interest, there were always sat a Vatican family man, somebody like Massimo Spada or Luigi Manini. Martin also pointed out that the special administration of the Holy See property, which was run by competent lay bankers, was advised by J.P. Morgan, the Brothers of London, and the Rothschilds of Paris. Ostling recounts the story of Boys Town, a Roman Catholic charity. Boys Town now was well worth over $200 million, including a securities portfolio valued at $157 million. Although the interest on such a nest egg is ample to operate the town, it still spends millions to send the traditional tearjerker fund appeals to 34 million people and raises nearly $18 million a year. This means Boys Town has about 3 times the endowment of Notre Dame University, raises more money than the Greater New York United Fund, and would rank 372nd in assets on the Fortune 500 if it were a business corporation. All this for 700 boys. All this came to light after much digging by a weekly newspaper back then in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, according to Mr. Nino Lobello, a Roman Catholic journalist, the Vatican is the only sovereign state that never publishes a budget. He was accused of exaggeration in his estimates of Vatican wealth, but suffice it to say, the wealth of the Vatican must be immense. For a simple, honest disclosure of its holdings, if they do not constitute great wealth, would lay to rest all the extravagant estimates of various writers. But such a disclosure has not been forthcoming, and I might add, still to this day, you cannot ever get a reasonable estimate because it is so vast. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I remember when I was covering the Alprin v. Vatican Bank story, John Levy, the attorney, tried to get the information on the Vatican Bank holdings. Impossible. Well, listen, that's just a little touch of what was written back in 1985. And it gets into a lot more detail as far as, maybe I'll pick it up tomorrow a little bit and then continue there's a whole lot of evil the next day. I'll let you know tomorrow. But anyway, the financial tentacles, the Vatican, reach out all over the world. And we'll get to that tomorrow. You're listening to the Investigative Journal. I'll be back tomorrow on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. So come back and we'll talk more about the story that's really never told. Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order. Back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.